I am going to go ahead and introduce Jim Parsons, our speaker for this afternoon. He is the Programs Director for Preservation Houston and is a native of Baytown. Preservation Houston, if you're not familiar, was founded in 1978, and it is Houston's only citywide nonprofit historic preservation organization. Jim puts his lifelong interest in local history and architecture to work coordinating programs and educational outreach for Preservation Houston, including architectural walking tours, video tours, and lectures. So Jim, I will thank you for being with us, and I will hand it over to you.
Can we tape this in case we want to hear it later? Record it?
Oh yes, we will be recording this. I should have mentioned that.
Okay, well, thanks, Rebecca, and thanks especially to Nan for coming up with the idea for this. Nan has heard me speak and yet invited me back, so she's a glutton for punishment, I guess. But I really do appreciate y'all having me. It's a real treat. I'm not going to take up too much of your time, but we are going to cover nearly 200 years of Houston history, so this will be fun. Let me try sharing my screen here. This is always a little bit inelegant, but you know, this is the world we live in now, right? So as you heard, I'm with Preservation Houston. I should mention, in addition to what Rebecca said, we are a membership organization, and we do public programs. We help you know, private property owners, but all of our work depends on the support of our members. So if you're interested in Houston's history and architecture, or if I can make you interested in Houston's history and architecture, please do look us up. You'll find us online at preservationhouston.org. And you can also follow us on social media for some interesting content about Houston history and architecture. We won't have time tonight for a Q&A, but I would invite you, if you have any questions about anything or just any questions about Houston in general, please feel free to drop me an email at any time. I'd be happy to answer. There's nothing I like more than talking about Houston. So there's my email address, and I will try to remember to put it in chat as well at the end of the program. So what I'm going to do this evening is a condensed version of a longer talk that I gave for Preservation Houston this summer that kind of is a quick look at Houston's history. Nan thought that this might be valuable not only for people who have lived here for a while, but also people who might be newer Houstonians. It's easy in Houston on a day-to-day basis to feel like sometimes this is a city that has no history at all. And the truth couldn't be further from that. We have a rich and fascinating and sometimes complicated history, and some of the people who helped build the city are really fascinating themselves. There are a lot of ways to approach such a big topic. I like to divide Houston's history up into three major periods that kind of help me understand it better, each of which is bookended by a significant event. And the first one we're going to talk about is this one, 1836 to 1900. 1836 is a big date in Texas history. It's the year that Texas won its independence from Mexico, and also a big date in Houston history because it happens to be the same year that the city was founded by two brothers from New York, Augustus Allen and John Kirby Allen. They had come to Texas in 1832 to get into land speculation, and ended up siding with the Texans when the Texans rebelled against Mexico. The Allens, you know, were kind of caught up in the revolutionary spirit, but they also had a profit motivation in mind because they figured when Texas won its independence from Mexico, it would need a capital city, and they might as well be the ones to build the capital, right? So a few weeks after the Battle of San Jacinto ended the Texas Revolution, the Allens bought land along Buffalo Bayou where it met White Oak Bayou, and that's the plot of land that became the nucleus of Houston. They had a city plan drawn up. This is actually upside down if you take the time to look at it. So north is down, but this is what we would consider the very northern tip of downtown, but this was the city as it existed back in 1836. They laid out a grid of streets perpendicular and parallel to Buffalo Bayou as it flowed past the town site. That explains why our downtown is off kilter to the rest of the city. It's because it's oriented to the curve of the bayou as it comes by Allen's Landing. And then they got to promoting Houston and encouraging people to move here. And people did move here, even though Houston was kind of out in the middle of nowhere in those days. But They were encouraged by the fact that Texas was declared the temporary capital. I'm sorry, that Houston was declared the temporary capital of the Republic of Texas. These are the earliest images of Houston that I know of. They were drawn by a woman named Mary Austin Holly, who visited here around Christmas time in 1837. She's drawn the Capitol building at the upper right, that two-story building that you see. And then her other pictures are just houses and business buildings. You'll notice there are what look like tents, and that's because they were tents. It was hard to get building material out here in the middle of nowhere, so a lot of Houstonians lived and conducted business in tents in the early days. I mentioned that Houston was the temporary capital of Texas. The Allen brothers were okay with that because they felt like once the government was established here, it would never ever leave. And it turned out they were not right in that assumption. In 1839, the government of Texas moved to what would become Austin. And without the government here, Houston realized it was going to have to rely on its business sense to get by. The city was still in a great position to trade with the outside world and with inland settlements in Texas. So the city's leaders took a series of steps to show that Houston was open for business. In 1841, we established the Port of Houston, which kicked off a long series of improvements to Buffalo Bayou to improve shipping. In 1853, we started building our first railroad out of Houston. And then 3 years later, we had ourselves designated the hub of the Texas rail network. And that was incredibly important because really the only way to efficiently get around and transport stuff through Texas was by train at that time. We had roads, but they weren't what we would consider roads. They were really like dirt paths. And if you know what kind of weather we have here, you can understand why a dirt road is not necessarily a good idea. They were often either mud themselves or were covered by giant puddles. So these railroads, especially the Houston and Texas Central, which was our first railroad, provided vital connections between Houston and the rest of Texas and then Texas and the outside world. By the end of the 1800s, there were thousands of miles of railroads in Texas, and most of those rail lines ended up connecting through Houston. So to give you an idea of what the city looked like while all this was happening, I showed you drawings a second ago. This is the first known photograph of Houston, taken in 1856 on Main Street in what was then the heart of downtown. We're looking toward Allen's Landing from about Congress Avenue, if you're familiar with that area. The business district that you see here was made up of wooden buildings. They had progressed a little bit from the tents, but they still weren't buildings we would be impressed by. A few years later, a picture was taken of one of our residential areas, and you can see the houses in this picture look like the houses that Mary Austin Holly drew in 1837. It was just not, I guess, what you would call a very impressive town, but we were still very much a frontier town. I want to show you these pictures specifically because things were about to change. Our growing rail network combined with our growing port allowed people and goods to start pouring into Houston. And this is really one of the big stories of Houston is a story of Houston being a boom town. Between 1850 and 1930, Houston's population basically doubled every 10 years. So if you can imagine starting small, you go from 4,000 to 8,000, not such a big deal, 8 to 16, but then somewhere down the line, you're jumping from 100,000 to 200,000 to 400,000 in 10 years, and it gets to be a pretty big deal. The city turned itself into a trading and distribution center thanks to our transportation and communication links. One of our advertising slogans from this time was that Houston was the Chicago of Texas, which is a reference to all these rail lines and all this trade that was happening. And one of the remarkable things about Houston's growth was we didn't have any natural advantage. We were built on a swamp on a narrow twisting bayou 50 miles inland from the Gulf of Mexico. We didn't manufacture much. We were not especially agricultural, but everybody who talked about Houston in these days said, well, it has a really lousy location, but the people in Houston really have a lot of energy and drive. And that's kind of also been the story of Houston all along. So headed into the last part of the 19th century, we were a city on the move. This is a bird's eye view from the 1870s that shows the city spreading out to the east and the south. And as we got bigger, we started building more impressive architecture. The Cotton Exchange building on the left, which is still there downtown. The Cayenne building in the center, which also still exists and in fact is being restored even as we speak. And the Benz building on the right, that was our first skyscraper because it reached 6 floors. It had an observation deck and an elevator. So people thought we were big business. That building, unfortunately, is gone. Our residential areas also got pretty impressive as our citizens got richer. The wealthy started out kind of in the northeastern part of downtown around the county courthouse, and they eventually migrated south. And these are pictures of 3 of the mansions that were along Main Street back in the day. If you drove south on Main from downtown into what we would now consider Midtown, you would have passed block after block after block of houses like this, and none of them are standing today, which is a real shame. By the end of the 19th century, we were a thriving city of about 45,000 people. We had strong industries, a growing transportation system, a developing skyline. I mean, look at us with our 6-story building. So things were looking pretty good. We were not the largest city in Texas. San Antonio was still bigger. And in our immediate vicinity, there was a rival that always overshadowed Houston in terms of wealth and influence, and that was Galveston, our neighbor to the south. But things kind of started to go bad for Galveston. Looking at the second period of Houston's history, 2 important things happened in 1900, and it's hard to say that they were things that we did. It was more like it was 2 things that happened to us. The first one, in early September 1900, our rival to the south got devastated by the Great Hurricane. Galveston, before the storm, had been the business and shipping center of Texas. It had a thriving port. It had a wholesale trade that covered the entire Southwest. It had huge banks, more millionaires per capita than any other city in the United States. The hurricane in September of 1900 brought an end to that golden era. It heavily damaged or destroyed 2/3 of the city. It washed away bridges and railroad lines, and it killed an estimated 8,000 people, which was 1 of every 5 Galveston residents. Galveston started to rebuild, but the damage was already done. Businesses relocated from the island up to Houston because we had a slightly more secure location and better rail connections. And we also picked up activity from the port in Galveston, which was closed on account of the hurricane. Then about 4 months later, on January the 10th, 1901, a huge geyser of oil exploded from a drilling site at Spindletop near Beaumont, about 90 miles to the east. The discovery was called the Lucas Gusher. It produced more than half of what all the other American oil wells combined were producing at that time. So if you can imagine 1 oil well producing more than half of the entire nation's output, that's what we were dealing with. There were major oil discoveries closer to Houston at Humble and Goose Creek, which is modern day Baytown, within a few years. Oil companies started moving to Houston because we had those good port and rail connections. And within a few years, there were 89 oil companies that were based here. And all of that highlighted a problem that Houston leaders had known about for some time, which was that our old port at Allen's Landing at the foot of Main Street, which is what you see here, could no longer handle the traffic that was coming its way. So we started planning a bigger, better port of Houston. It was completed in 1914, a few miles east of downtown. It connected up with Galveston Bay via a 100-foot wide, 25-foot deep ship channel that was built from the turning basin, which is what you see here. And the new port meant that the largest ocean-going vessels could dock directly at Houston and transfer goods to and from all the trains that were passing through the city. And this period really was the beginning of the phenomenal growth that made Houston famous. And it set the stage, too, for our first real group of philanthropists. And this is a detour I wanted to take because of the business that y'all are in. I wanted to mention 4 people who kind of came out of this era whose names we still know today. George Sherman was one. He was a native Houstonian, grew up here and made millions of dollars in real estate and oil. And when he died in 1914, he willed the bulk of his estate to the people of Houston in the form of land for Herman Park, which you see here, and also an endowment for Herman Hospital. Right across the street from Herman Park was the legacy of another Houston philanthropist, William Marsh Rice, who also wins the Best Hair Award. Rice came to Houston in the city's early days and made a fortune in shipping, warehousing, merchandising, cotton, real estate, and he made arrangements for his money to support a first-class educational system, or institution, rather, in Houston. He ended up being murdered in 1900, which is a story that I wish I could tell you, but I'll have to tell you another time. But the upshot of this was the institution that he had planned for became Rice University. Another oil man who made an impact on Houston was Hugh Roy Cullen. He became one of the richest men in the world virtually overnight when he struck oil at the O'Connor Ranch in South Texas in 1933. And he went on to give away an estimated 90% of his considerable fortune. The two biggest beneficiaries of that were the University of Houston and the Texas Medical Center. And the last kind of high profile guy I want to talk about from this period was Jesse Jones. He came to Houston right at the end of the 19th century to manage his uncle's lumber yard. And he ended up becoming one of the city's most powerful builders and businessmen. He built dozens of office buildings, hotels, and movie theaters in Houston. He virtually single-handedly gave us a modern skyline, complete with what he considered its crown jewel, which was the 37-story Gulf building, which still stands today. It's worth mentioning Jones was also instrumental in getting the ship channel built. He had a distinguished career in public service. He handled government loans during the Depression, and then he helped US industry ramp up for World War II. And he ensured continuing support for Houston through the Houston Endowment, which he founded with his wife in 1937. It's given hundreds of millions of dollars to local institutions since then. There's a whole lot more to say about Jesse Jones, but that would be a whole presentation on its own. So if you're interested and there's a lot more to know about him, please do look him up. Coming back to the topic of growth, I mentioned that this pre-World War II period really set Houston up for its big 20th century growth spurt. We continued growing through the 20s and 30s. We overtook San Antonio to become the largest city in Texas, and that sets us up for the final period in Houston's history, which began in 1945 and brings us through the present day. 1945 doesn't have anything to do with the end of World War II, but it has to do with something that is much more locally significant. This picture will give you a clue. It's a sign in a field that marked the beginning of what would become the largest medical complex in the world. The Texas Medical Center got its charter from the state of Texas in November of 1945, but the idea for a medical center had started a few years before when a cotton executive named Monroe Anderson, who we know as MD Anderson, died and left $19 million in a foundation that was dedicated to the promotion of health, science, and education. Two Houston doctors encouraged the MD Anderson Foundation's trustees to invest in what they called a city of medicine, where education, research, and patient care institutions could work together. About 130 acres of city-owned land adjacent to Herman Park were set aside for the new medical center. Baylor College of Medicine became the first institution to build there in 1948. You can see the Baylor building out in the woods behind Herman Hospital there. And needless to say, the medical center really took off. Today, it comprises 54 member institutions and treats more than 7 million patients a year. It was one of the smartest things that Houston ever did, creating the medical center. Now, on a more prosaic note, we had a problem back at this time that you'll probably be really familiar with, which is traffic. By the late 1940s, the city's population was nearing 600,000 people, and every one of those people was driving 4 cars every day. We did some street widening and improvement at the time, but it became clear that something bigger was needed, which could move a lot of cars a long way fast. And the answer was what they called the highway of the future, the Galveston-Houston superhighway. It was a divided 6-lane controlled access, stop-free highway with continuous frontage roads in both directions that would allow for commercial development all along the route. This, of course, became the Gulf Freeway. The first section opened in 1948, and it was extended all the way to Galveston in 1952. This was the first freeway in the state of Texas. And we ended up building a complete freeway system over the next couple of decades. The freeways opened up new areas for suburban development, and they also kind of had an unintended consequence. People initially thought everybody would live in the suburbs but use the freeways to commute downtown. But what really happened was we started getting satellite downtowns. So places like Greenway Plaza on the left here and Greens Point on the right ended up siphoning away offices and apartment living from the original downtown core. And that's how Houston kind of ended up with all of these downtowns that confuse visitors. The splashiest of these freeway-oriented developments was the Galleria, which opened in 1970. It was something completely new for its time, an enclosed shopping mall that had office buildings and hotels directly attached to it, and no one had ever done that before. The developer, Gerald Hines, predicted that the Galleria would become the center of a new downtown for Houston, and he was right about that. Uptown today has about 28 million square feet of office space, which is about the size of downtown Denver or downtown Atlanta. Now, there's one more component of Houston's modern identity that came out of this period. It was marked by President Kennedy's speech at Rice Stadium on September 12, 1962, when he announced the goal of landing a man on the moon by the end of the decade. As he said, not because it was easy, but because it was hard. About a year after his speech, NASA's Manned Spacecraft Center opened in Clear Lake. The complex was later renamed Johnson Space Center, and of course, it's where training, research, and flight control for manned spaceflight took place. As you know, in 1969, we did send men to the moon, and then we brought them back safely to Earth, just as JFK had promised. And Houston immediately embraced its new role as Space City, USA. And it's something that we don't talk about as much now as we used to, but I think it's something that Houstonians are still pretty proud of. NASA did help to put Houston on the map in the 1960s, but there was something more earthbound that really drew people's attention at the same time. In early 1962, just a few months before JFK talked about sending men to the moon, a group of Harris County officials gathered and shot guns into the ground to break ground for our new sports stadium, because, I mean, why not? They all were carrying guns, and so this is just like a stereotypically Texan thing to do. Construction took 3 years, and it was unlike anything anyone had seen before. It was not that any part of this project was particularly groundbreaking, but it was more so that no one had put all the components that formed this stadium together on such a large scale before. The stadium, of course, is officially the Harris County Dome Stadium, better known as the Astrodome. It opened in April 1965 and was the first ever fully enclosed, totally air-conditioned stadium, and it became world famous immediately. If you've been around long enough to remember the Astrodome, you might also remember what Houston was like in the 60s and 70s, in part because of the collapse of economies in the Rust Belt, and in part because of federal immigration changes. People flooded into Houston. We welcomed them with jobs and new suburbs. And you can see in this chart at the population growth here, the blue line is the city itself, the orange line is the metro area, and the city kind of grows steadily, and the metro area starts taking this sharp increase because of the rise of the suburbs. At the peak of its population growth in 1978, nearly 10,000 people were moving into Houston every month. And I mentioned earlier, every Houstonian driving at least 4 cars. By the 70s, we all drove at least 8 cars, and this is what our burgeoning freeway system looked like. We quickly discovered that all these nifty new freeways we had been building couldn't keep up with traffic, and that's still an issue that is plaguing us today. It was during this time in the 70s and 80s that we built our famous skyline as the people and the money kept flowing in. The oil bust of the mid-80s put a stop to that, but for a while, the way that we think of some of the cities in the Middle East, I kind of like to think people looked at Houston in the 80s the way that we look at Dubai now, with kind of unimaginable wealth and this futuristic skyline. It's something that we forget, but for a while there, we were this kind of boom town like no one had ever seen. And I want to pause here for just a second to say, I'm going to jump ahead a bit to bring our story up to date, which means speeding past a lot of developments in the last 40 years, but I do want to touch on one thing that I think is the most important story of Houston in the last 40 years, which is the growth and change in our population. Going back to this population chart, but extending it out from 1980, you can see what really happened. The city of Houston, again, that blue line kept increasing in population pretty steadily, but look at the orange line. The greater Houston jumped from about 2.8 million people in 1980 to an estimated 7 million people today. So that's all suburban growth. What you can't tell from this graph is something that many of you probably know, that growth has mostly been non-white populations, especially in the last 10 years. Greater Houston has no majority ethnic group today. It's often said that we're the most diverse metro area in the country, and this growth has given us that diversity, and that diversity is one of our big strengths. Many of you probably know about the reports that Stephen Kleinberg at Rice University does on this. He can explain all this way better than I can, so if it's not a topic you're familiar with, look up Professor Kleinberg's reports, and there's some fascinating stuff. What I want to do in our last few minutes is talk about some of the ways that Houston is reshaping itself for the 21st century, and how we're working through some of the challenges that came with this phenomenal growth that we've experienced. If you go back to our pretty skyline for a minute, this always projected kind of a glamorous, confident image of Houston, but the truth on the ground was, as all these people were flooding in, Houston was like, well, we don't have to worry if it's a nice place to live because people are just never going to stop coming. So in some parts of town, that meant half-delivered municipal services. In other parts of town, it meant jumbles of asphalt and billboards with little regard for civic beauty. And downtown, if you looked beyond this glitzy skyline, downtown was what some of you may remember. It was these beautiful skyscrapers surrounded by acres and acres of parking lots. And at 5 o'clock, it completely emptied out. And this poor guy in the top picture was the only one left down there. What we've seen in recent years is a huge turnaround downtown, thanks in part to projects like Discovery Green, which opened in 2008 on the site of some of those parking lots I just showed you. Discovery Green has spurred a couple of $1 billion of development in its immediate area. It has brought more than 1.5 million people downtown for recreation every year, which is something that Houstonians would have laughed at you for 20 years ago. There's also been a renewed interest in our in-town neighborhoods in recent years. Not to say Houstonians haven't always been into their neighborhoods, but there's been a mix of historic preservation projects, creative reuse of existing buildings, thoughtful construction of new ones, and a general trend of people moving back into town from the suburbs. And that has meant that some of our most historic areas have been revitalized. We've also seen investments in park and gathering spaces in some of our most historic neighborhoods. You may recognize the Navigation Boulevard Esplanade in 2nd Ward in the top picture, and the beautiful Emancipation Park in 3rd Ward at the bottom. Both of these had really successful overhauls recently. We're also taking a new look at our bayous. The bayous, of course, are not new, but for many years, we either considered them oversized drainage ditches, which is not totally wrong, or dumping grounds, which is kind of gross. In recent years, the bayous have gotten a lot cleaner than they used to be, and we've also seen a push toward treating them as assets rather than as utilities. So Buffalo Bayou Park here, just west of downtown, is a great example that shows we can build useful parkland along the bayous, but still keep them flood resilient without having to make them big concrete drainage ditches. And speaking of flooding, I can't finish today without mentioning a couple other big events in our recent history. Hurricane Harvey, of course, in 2017, which became one of our most historic floods when it hit. And then last year we had Tropical Storm Imelda, which was smaller, but still impactful. You remember the images, of course, from these floods. This is Harvey, but Imelda was similar in a lot of ways. The flooding was devastating in both storms, hundreds of billions of dollars in damage. And remember, both of these were supposed to be 1,000-year floods. These were supposed to be the kind of events that we might see once in our lifetime, but then we wouldn't see for generations and generations. These happened 2 years apart. So obviously, changing weather, changing growth patterns, inadequate drainage, there's something that's not adding up here. And I bring these floods up not to end on a downer, but to show that Houston does have big challenges to face in terms of our weather and our planning and our growth and our housing, education, opportunities for different populations, any number of things. There are new challenges every day, as 2020 has shown us. It seems like every day something else comes up that we never thought we would see. There's still a lot to figure out, and how we do it is going to become part of Houston's story moving forward. So we can gather in a few years and maybe we can talk about what's been done since 2020. There's a lot more that I wish I could talk about, but trying to be respectful of your time, I'll go ahead and wrap things up. Again, if any of you have any questions or comments, please do drop me a line. I would love to hear from you. And that said, I really do appreciate your time and your attention. Thank you so much for being with me and letting me be with you.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you so much, Jim. That was amazing. Getting a round of applause.
Oh, thank you.